Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission American Eel Board. I'd like to call this meeting to order. I'm Chris Kuhn. I'm the administrative proxy for Pennsylvania, and today I'm going to begin as chairmanship of the American Eel Management Board. So please bear with me as I transition into this new role. I want to thank Phil Edwards for his service and leadership in this capacity previously. We currently do not have a vice chair for this board, but when that time comes to seek a nomination, please let us know if you're interested. Our technical committee chair is Danielle Carty from South Carolina. Advisory panel chair is Mary Beth DeLuca with the Nature Conservancy. And our law enforcement representative is Rob Beal from Maine. I'm joined at the front table here by Caitlin Starks and Dr. Kristen Anstead. So we'll go ahead and get started with today's meeting, and the first order of business is approval of the agenda. Are there any proposed modifications to the agenda? All right, seeing none in the room, are there any hands online? Okay, seeing none, the agenda is approved by consent. Next, we'll move on to the approval of the proceedings from the October 2023 board meeting. Are there any edits to the proceedings from October 2023? All right, seeing none again, the proceedings from 2023 are approved by consent. Next up is public comment. Are there any public comments pertaining to items that are not on today's agenda? Again, items not on today's agenda. Yes, Sarah Rodmacher.
Good afternoon. I thank you for the opportunity to speak. I just wanted to quickly introduce myself. My name is Sarah Rademacher. I'm the owner of American Unagi, the aquaculture farm that is up in Maine. I just wanted to share a couple of quick updates on the farm in Maine. 10 years ago, I started with this idea to grow eels in Maine, and now we have the largest eel aquaculture farm in North America, and it is being watched globally. And I've had a lot of reach outs from people around the world who are very encouraged to see what we're doing in the US. So much of the success of this business has been because of the aquaculture quota that was approved back in 2018 by the Atlantic States. From that, we've been able to build out this operation year over year, and now we can take 500 pounds of glass eels and grow them out to 500,000 pounds of adult yellow eels. That is only 5% of the US market right now. So we're still importing around 11 million pounds of product from China. So there is a lot of opportunity up in Maine with our success to build more aquaculture facilities. So I just wanted to thank the Atlantic States for the continued support and approval of our aquaculture quota, and also invite any of you who are interested to come see our facility up in Maine to please reach out. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll remind myself, because I didn't have it down when I said thank you, but I'll just remind commissioners and others when making comments to move their mics down so we can hear you. Okay, so moving on to item number 4 on the agenda, which is to consider the approval of addendum 6 on Maine's glass eel quota for public comment. This is an action item, and we have 2 primary considerations to decide upon today based on board motions from 2023, August of 2023, and those are options for Maine's glass eel quota and then the time frame for Maine's glass eel quota. So Caitlin Starks is going to start us off with a presentation, and following that, we'll take questions on the presentation. Caitlin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in my presentation, I'm going to start off with the timeline for the development of this addendum, the problem statement and background, and then cover the proposed management options and end with next steps. So draft addendum 6 was initiated in August 2023 when the board moved to initiate an addendum to address the Maine glass eel quota. And following that meeting, the plan development team, or PDT, developed the draft addendum document for public comment. And today the board will consider approving the document for public comment. If it's approved, we would have the public comment period and hearings in February, and the board would be able to consider this action for final action in May. And that would allow enough time for the implementation of the measures before January 2025. The statement of the problem and reason for this addendum is that Maine's commercial glass eel quota needs to be established for 2025 and beyond. The quota was set for 2015 through 2017 at 9,688 pounds by Addendum 5. Addendum 4, and then Addendum 5 maintained that quota, which has been extended via board action through 2024. However, fishing beyond 2024 requires an addendum, so draft Addendum 6 is addressing this issue by considering implementation of a Maine glass eel commercial quota for 2025 and beyond. Since 2015, when the quota was implemented, Maine's annual glass eel landings have remained below that quota. The fishery is monitored using a swipe card program to track individual fishing quotas daily and track glass eel catch with associated weights from dealer purchase to export. And as a condition of the glass eel fishery, Maine also conducts life cycle monitoring. They've conducted the young of year eel survey since 2001 and the yellow eel, silver eel survey since 2018. And in that young of year data, there's been a linear increasing trend. For the glass eel elver catch per unit effort for the fishery, that's also been calculated since 2016. So for some visuals, this is the annual Maine glass eel landings shown by the columns and the X vessel value shown by the black line. And then on the next slide here is the Maine glass eel young of year survey results for each year with catch on the y-axis and the linear trend shown by the dashed line. And then this graph compares the young of year survey results with the harvester CPUE. So the top line is the CPUE and the bottom is the YOY survey catch. And the trends in these two data sets have tracked each other pretty closely for the available time series. Next slide. So I'll move into the proposed management options. For quota levels, the PDT developed two options. And option 1 is status quo, which would be 9,688 pounds. And then option 2 is to reduce the Maine quota by 21.8%. That 21.8% is derived from the yellow eel draft addendum, which we'll talk about later, and it's equivalent to the smallest percent reduction that's being considered for yellow eel in their coastwide cap. Option 2 would result in an annual quota of 7,576 pounds. And the rationale for this option was responding to the stock assessment results, which indicate the stock's depleted status. And they chose to go with the smallest reduction for yellow eel as this percent reduction for glass eel, given glass eel experience a higher natural mortality rate than yellow eel and are therefore thought to have a lower relative impact to the coastwide population than yellow eel harvest does. So the second set of options in section 3.2 are regarding the duration of the quota that's established at final action. Option 1 would be no sunset, meaning the quota would remain the same indefinitely unless it's changed through another addendum or amendment. Option 2 is a 3-year duration, after which the board would have to initiate a new addendum to establish Maine's glass eel quota for 2028 and beyond. And then option 3 is a 3-year duration, where after that period, the board could extend the quota indefinitely via board action. And if a change to the quota is desired under option 3, then a new addendum would be needed. So as I mentioned at the outset, after the board considers this draft addendum for approval for public comment, if we have approval, the public hearings and comment could occur this February, and the board would be able to consider those comments and the draft addendum for final approval at the spring commission meeting. And then Maine would be able to implement the quota for 2025. So with that, the board actions for consideration today are whether the board wants to make any modifications to the draft addendum before it goes out for comment, and then to consider approval of the draft addendum for public comment. And I can take any questions.
Thank you, Caitlin. Any questions for Caitlin? Shannon Madsen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually have a couple of questions. So I'm going to start off with the quota questions, and then I also have a couple of questions about the time frame. So just cut me off if I'm going too long. My first question in regards to the quota is, I was a little bit confused in seeing option 2, a reduction. I think I was confused because I guess my question is, didn't the assessment say that the abundance of yellow eel is what's driving the depletion of the stock currently?
I'm not sure it said what's driving it, but it's it's where the assessment is noting a decline in relative abundance.
Okay, and then secondarily, I guess I was also surprised because I was reading some of the memos, the previous memos from the yellow eel PDT, which actually recommended that it, like an option essentially of trying to pursue some sort of switch from yellow eel fishing to glass eel fishing because of the mortality rates on glass eels are so much higher, natural mortality. Was I also correct in that? So was that a recommendation as well of the other PDT?
The other PDT did discuss that and ultimately decided not to put forward any options related to that idea.
Okay, thank you. Oh, one more, sorry. I forgot about my time frame question. I was a little confused on the time frame question for option 3 that you had up there. I think for option 3, you said that the board can extend the quota indefinitely, but the way that I read this was that the board can extend a quota for up to 3 years at a time. And then the way I read this is sort of as like a spec setting process where after those 3 years, we would come back and determine whether or not we wanted to continue with that quota based off of some data that the TC would be providing us, I'm guessing. So it just seemed like what was on the screen was different than what I was at least interpreting option 3 in the document to say. So I just wanted to kind of get clarification on that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It does say in the addendum draft that this would allow the board to extend the quota for up to 3 years at a time until the provision is modified by another addendum or amendment. And I think it would be up to the board to ask for the technical committee to provide some kind of update for them to consider when they're considering extending the quota.
Okay, so option 3 is an indefinite extension of quota. It's just every 3 years. The other question I had is, I was reading through the PDT's recommendations on these timings, and it seemed like they wanted to go with option 2 because they felt like it was important for us to review the quota every 3 years in some time frame. If we would like to make a motion to essentially clarify in option 3 that we would come back after those 3 years and make some considerations before we move forward with extending the quota for another 3 years or changing the quota, whatever that ends up looking like. I feel like that would sort of get to their concerns with option 3, and I'd be happy to add something along those lines whenever is appropriate.
Okay, we have another question, Lynn Fegley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to start by saying that I have no problem with this going out for public comment, but I'm really struggling to put all the pieces together with eels, I admit it. And so I wanted to ask a question about the paper that was brought to our attention by Shirishi and Keifu, entitled An Early Warning of an Upsurge of International Trade in the American Eel, that seems to say that they're concerned about the impacts of large amounts of glass eels being sent over, being imported into Asia, potentially having an impact on the range-wide population. And the TC is clear that this shouldn't affect our decision on the glass eel quota, but I'm really trying to, I understand the point about the mortality being very high on the glass eel, so that's where the mortality should be focused. But then we have people saying that maybe the glass eel fishery, this glass eel catch could be a negative impact on the coastwide, or it doesn't say coastwide, but the global range of the animal. So which is it? I mean, glass eels become yellow eels, become silver eels, produce baby eels. So I'm really trying to understand, just in order to answer cogently to people who ask me, should we worry or not about the increasing harvest of the young eels globally? Thank you.
I'll take that one. The TC did bring this paper up for discussion, and it was mostly just kind of to flag it that there seems to be evidence that there's been a lot of export of glass eel. Now, you might have noticed in the paper, the exports being attributed to the US is higher than our current quota. And that's because the way that the exporting works, sometimes we get exports from like the Caribbean and then they get attributed to the US. Yeah, so it's a lot of eel moving through the US that then get attributed to us. So I just want to be clear that there's no concern that we're exporting like illegally harvested US eel. Second, I think that there was a concern that a huge increase in glass eels from the Caribbean could potentially affect the stock range wide. And that's something to consider because there's always this opportunity on the table to do a range wide assessment, and events like this would support a movement to considering this on a larger scale. But it's true that the mortality on glass eels isn't as concerning as it is on the yellow eel stage, but certainly if the data in that paper are true, it's something we should consider when we're talking about the future of eel.
Thank you for that question and response. Appreciate it. Are there any hands online? So, okay, if there are no more questions on the presentation, let's open it up to discussion around the table before we move on to any motions. Is there any discussion? Megan Ware.
Thanks. I had two suggested modifications to the intro of the document. I don't think those would require a motion. And then I had sent a motion to staff, but I'll start with the two suggestions. The first is on page 5, section 2.4, status of the stock. That first paragraph talks about the assessment and the recommendation for the reduction in the yellow eel fishery. Given this addendum is on the glass eel fishery, I think a pretty logical question from the public will be, what was the recommendation coming out of the assessment for glass eels? My understanding is there is no recommendation for a reduction in F, so I would ask that that be added to that paragraph. And then on that same page, the next paragraph, it talks about the MARS models that were used. And I'll just use the YOY sentence as an example, but the addendum says a declining trend in coastwide YOY abundance was observed. I think when I went back to the assessment report, the assessment is, I'll say, a little more nuanced in the statement that it reads. It says there's a slightly declining trend, but that the confidence intervals overlap 0, which would indicate a stable population. So I think there's kind of two different things you could take away from the addendum versus the assessment. So I would just ask that those get better aligned. Maybe just take the sentence from the assessment and put that in there. Thank you.
Those changes acceptable?
Yes, I'm clear on those changes. So as long as that's the will of the board, I can do that.
Yes, Shannon Madsen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'm going to try to do the same thing that Megan did and not make a motion, but just a recommendation. I think that if in option 3, we clarified that we would come back to the table after those 3 years. And essentially, I think the type of information that I was anticipating the board receiving before deciding on either extending the quota or going into an addendum process was essentially the information that you presented today and was presented in this addendum. I don't think I need to see a addendum in order to make that consideration. I think that the board can look at this sort of information as they're doing now and make that consideration then without having to go through the whole addendum process for something as simple as dealing with quota.
Thank you. Is there any objections to that change? Yes, we have a hand online. Eric Reed. If you're talking, Eric, we can't hear you.
Oh, so sorry, I had my own destiny in my own hands. I can unmute myself. So I have a question. Honestly, I'm not all that thrilled about the 20-something% reduction in option 2. But my question would be, what would be the impact on that to the unagi set aside? Let's call it the unagi set aside because that's what happens. Will their 500 pounds become 400 pounds, or how does that work? Or how would that work?
I'm not sure I have an answer to that question, Eric. but it looks like Bob or Tony does.
Eric, if you're referring to the 200 pounds that we set aside for aquaculture, that would not be impacted. Are you referring to a different set aside?
No, I thought Miss Unagi herself said it was 500 pounds turned into something else, but if it was only 200, maybe I didn't hear her correctly. But I just was wondering if the overall quota goes down, does it affect the RSA? And you're saying no. So, thank you.
I have a clarification to that point, I believe. So American Unagi gets their 200-pound allocation from Maine through the aquaculture program in our FMP, and then they're also able to buy glass eel from the industry.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Caitlin. Any other comments, questions around the table? Anyone at the point where there's time for a motion? Megan Ware.
Thank you. So I am pretty concerned that there's an option in the document for a 21.8% reduction when there's no recommendation coming out of the assessment for a reduction in F. I don't see the statement problem in the addendum acknowledging a need for a reduction in F, and the economic impacts of this are pretty severe. So I had sent a motion to staff. I'll read it into the record. I would appreciate a second for an opportunity on rationale. So move to remove in section 3.1, option 2, reduce Maine's glass eel quota by 21.8%.
Thanks for that. Do we have a second? Eric Reed, second.
Thank you. So I was able to listen into both of the PDT meetings on this. I heard many PDT members struggling to identify and justify a quota reduction. As the PDT memos note, there's no specific recommendation coming out of the assessment to reduce F in the glass eel fishery. Maine surveys are actually increasing, and I think this reflects a lot of the efforts that the state has put in to improve connectivity in the state. And the identification of any amount or percent reduction at this point is arbitrary. I understand that our next topic is considering the yellow eel fishery, and they're facing potential reductions in the catch cap. That said, I don't find that a compelling argument or justification for a 21.8% reduction in Maine's glass eel quota. The assessment is very clear that harvesting glass eels has a lower impact on the population given that high natural mortality rate. And to quote the assessment here, quote, the glass eel fishery could withstand a greater amount of fishing mortality than the yellow eel fishery. And to quote, the addition of fishing mortality to natural mortality at the glass eel stage has a much lower relative effect on total mortality compared to the addition of fishing mortality to natural mortality at the yellow eel stage. The economic impacts of this cannot be understated. Based on 2022 numbers, I estimate that this is about a $4 million impact in just X vessel value to the state. This impacts not only those who are licensed through DMR, but also our tribal nations in Maine. By law, they get a portion of our Maine glass eel quota. So I am concerned that with this option in the document, Maine, which has no recommendation for a reduction, whose surveys are increasing, is really facing the biggest socioeconomic hit here. So I would ask that the board take this option out ahead of public comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Eric Reed, a seconder, would you like to provide any additional rationale for the motion?
Ms. Ware covered it really well, but I mean, the socioeconomic impact is, these aren't 90-footers glass eel fishing. These are artisanal fishermen and tribal fishermen, and I think that there's really no basis for it in the problem statement. It's a regulatory housekeeping issue, not a biological issue. So I just don't see option 2 being anywhere near proper for this document. There's other options for timing and et cetera, but option 2 doesn't belong in this document. It's not fair to the state of Maine, and it's not necessary to the biology of the eels themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Bill Hyatt.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this isn't a substantive comment, but I just wonder if somebody from the commission might speak to the history of sending out addendums with only a single option.
I think we've done it before. There's no There's no regulations or information that say you can't. We've done it in the past. In this fishery is maybe last time. Oh, we did maybe have one other option the last time for a glass eel, but we have done it in other fisheries.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Tony. So we're starting behind schedule, but is there any members of the public that would like to make comment on this motion? Okay, seeing none. Discussion on the motion. Adam Walski.
So given that we have a annual quota for Maine's commercial glass eel fishery in place already without a finite end date for it, what would even be the purpose of continuing this addendum if we remove this option? I understand that there's a section here about the timelines here with the 3 years, but essentially by taking this out, it would seem that our message is we intend to keep the Maine commercial glass eel quota status quo, period. And we would just bring forward another addendum. So what purpose does this even serve if we take this out?
So if it's removed and the action is not approved, then Maine would not have a quota for 2025. So that is kind of an alternative option to remaining status quo, if you will, with the quota number that they have now.
Any additional discussion? John Clark.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And while I don't think there'd be any reason to put this on Maine, this type of reduction, keeping it in the addendum, I don't see there's any problem with that. It probably reduces cognitive dissonance for people looking at this, especially yellow wheel fishermen. They're seeing some of these caps are like minuscule, and yet the message is that you can catch as many glass seals as you want. That doesn't have any impact on the yellow wheel stock, which obviously a lot of glass seals grow up into yellow wheels. So I don't see any problem in keeping it in there. I really don't think it's going to be something that will affect Maine. I doubt that will happen, but just in the sense of fairness, to have that in there, since yellow wheels are possibly facing a cap cut. And then just to show the public that, we're looking at the same type of options across the board for eels.
Thanks, John. Shanna.
I think this question is for Megan. Megan, could you maybe enlighten the board on what a public hearing would look like if you're going out and saying that you're going to potentially reduce Maine's glass eel quota by 21%?
Sure. I would expect a very lively public hearing. I would be requesting Marine Patrol at this hearing. I'm not trying to make light of the situation. This is not an insignificant option to be bringing out for public comment. This is potentially catastrophic here for the fishery. So if the board is not serious about this option, I would ask that we remove it. I think if the board isn't serious and the only reason to bring it in, to keep it in, is to say, well, we want a range, or we want the yellow eel fishery to see that we're considering something else, I don't find that a strong enough justification for people to feel like their livelihoods are threatened.
Any additional discussion on this motion? Nothing online? Okay, I guess we're ready to call the question. Is there a need for caucus? Go 2 minutes for caucus. Okay, 2 minutes is up. So we'll go ahead and call the question. All those in favor, please raise your hands. Okay, you can put your hands down. All opposed? 3 opposed. Any null votes? Abstentions?
All fisheries
The
abstains.
motion passes 14-3-0 to 2. Okay, so we still need to account for the time frame, correct? The time frame aspect of this. So we'll go back to the table to discuss the options for the time frame. So is there any modifications for the time frame motion at this time? Is there anyone willing to make a motion regarding the time frame options? Just for the approval of the addendum, rather. Megan Ware.
So I think it would be moved to approve the addendum for public comment as modified today. Yeah, move to approve draft addendum 6 for public comment as modified today.
Thank you, Megan. Seconded by Sheree Patterson. Okay, we'll try and do this the easy way. Is there any opposition to the motion? Seeing none, motion passes by consent. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on to item 5 in the agenda, which is to consider the approval of draft addendum 7 on yellow wheel coastwide cap and monitoring requirements for public comment. We have multiple considerations in this draft addendum. Caitlin Starks is again going to lead us into questions and discussion with the presentation. Then we'll take questions on the presentation. Caitlin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And at the start, I'm just going to note that this is a much longer one, so please hang in there. So in this presentation, I'm going to start off with the timeline and background information on this addendum, including the problem statement, recent data, and monitoring requirements relevant to the action. And then I'll go over the proposed management options, which address the yellow eel coastwide cap and management response to exceeding the cap, the young of year survey requirements, and catch and effort reporting requirements. And then we'll talk about the next steps. So as a reminder, this addendum was also initiated in August 2023 after the board reviewed the 2023 benchmark stock assessment. And then this fall, the plan development team drafted management options and put this document together. So now here we are in January, and today the board will consider draft addendum 7 for public comment. So back in August, the board approved the recent benchmark stock assessment for American eel for management use. And this assessment found that the American eel stock is depleted, and it recommended that yellow eel catch be reduced. So in response to the stock assessment findings and recommendation, the board initiated draft addendum 7 to address coastwide catch of yellow eel by using the recommended tool in the assessment called iTarget to recommend a range of catch caps. This addendum addresses the poor stock condition of American eel and the fact that the assessment has not been able to provide biologically based reference points upon which to base management of yellow eel. And instead, the current coastwide cap that we have is based on historical landings. While the 2023 assessment still hasn't provided biological reference points, it did identify a trend-based tool that could be used to inform management, which is iTarget. And iTarget uses only the time series of coastwide landings and the fishery independent abundance indices to provide catch advice. So this graph is showing the yellow eel abundance index, which is the dotted gray line, and the coastwide landings, which is the black line. And this is showing you the decline in both the abundance index and landings over time. The addendum also considers some options to change some monitoring requirements based on recommendations from the stock assessment subcommittee and technical committee. So the PDT, taking these recommendations, thought it was worthwhile to group these together with the yellow eel options in this addendum. So first, the 2023 assessment indicated that the biological sampling that's required as part of the state young of year surveys, specifically the individual lengths and pigment stage, that those could be made optional because the data have not been able to inform trends in the stock. Additionally, it notes that the catch per unit effort data that are provided by the states have not been used in any of the stock assessments up until now, as was intended for those data, because they're not indicative of trends in the stock as a whole. So moving into the review of the options, the proposed options are organized in the document by issue, starting with options on the coastwide yellow eel harvest cap and the management response to exceeding that, and then the time frame for the yellow eel provisions, followed by options for the young of year survey and the catch and effort monitoring requirements. So section 3.1, issue 1, deals with the yellow eel coastwide harvest cap. Our current cap is 916,473 pounds, and that's based on the average landings from 1998 to 2010. and this is our status quo option. There are 4 additional options which propose a range of alternative harvest caps using the iTarget tool with different configurations based on management goals. So as a reminder, when using iTarget, there are these 3 variables or knobs that can be adjusted to configure the tool. And these are the reference period, multiplier, and threshold. The reference period is meant to be a time period where the population is stable or at a desirable abundance level. And then the multiplier determines the level of abundance that the management is aiming to achieve. So if the multiplier is set to 1, that means you're aiming to achieve the same abundance from the reference period that's set. And if you use a multiplier of 1.25, that means you're aiming to achieve an abundance level that's 25% higher than what it was during the reference period. And then our last one here is the threshold value, and that's a portion of the iTarget value that depends on the goals of the fishery. So a threshold of 0.5 is less conservative and would generally result in higher catch caps, whereas a threshold of 0.8 is a more conservative value. And that was what was recommended by the Northeast Fishery Science Center when they used or evaluated the use of this tool. So just another note, when the Stock Assessment Subcommittee recommended using our iTarget, they recommended that the board use the threshold value rather than the other 2 knobs to adjust the configuration in setting management. So in the options, okay, it's really difficult to see on the screen, so I apologize, but in the options that use iTarget to recommend a catch cap, you'll see that there are 2 different reference points that are used, reference periods, and these are identified by the orange and blue shaded areas, which are really hard to see. But these 2 reference periods were based on distinct regimes that were identified in the stock assessment. So the blue area, which is the earlier reference period from 1974 to 1987, in that reference period, the abundance index was higher, representing a more desirable abundance level. And then the later reference period, which is in an orange square, is a period of lower abundance, but still above the abundance in our most recent decades. So this table is showing the 4 proposed options for coastwide caps based on iTarget. Option 2 and 3 both use the earlier reference period, and they both use a multiplier value of 1.25, meaning they're both aiming to achieve stock abundance that's 25% greater than the abundance during that earlier reference period. They differ in that option 2 uses a threshold of 0.8, which is again the more conservative threshold, which would result in a coastwide cap of 202,453 pounds. And then option 3 uses a threshold of 0.5, which is the less conservative threshold value, resulting in a coastwide cap of 518,281 pounds. And then options 4 and 5 use the later reference period, which is 1988 to 1999. And they both use a threshold value of 0.5, which is the less conservative threshold. However, option 4 uses a multiplier of 1.5 and option 5 uses a multiplier of 1.25. So this means these 2 options are aiming for 2 different levels of stock abundance. Option 4 is aiming for 50% greater abundance than the reference period, and option 5 is aiming for 25% greater than that reference period. And to try and better explain how these options compare to each other, this is how they compare in terms of the abundance level they're aiming to achieve. So the target abundance increases from the bottom up. So options 2 and 3 both aim for the highest level of relative abundance, and then option 5 aims for the lowest relative abundance, and option 4 is between those. And in this graph, you can see the coastwide caps that would result from each of these options compared to the current coastwide cap and the coastwide yellow eel landing since 2015. So our current cap is the black dashed line at the top, and that has not been exceeded since 2016. And then of the alternative options, option 5 would result in the highest cap, and landings have not exceeded that level since 2018. So functionally, it has the least potential to reduce fishing mortality. The caps under options 3 and 4 are pretty similar. Those are the yellow and green dot dash lines in the middle, and the landings have not exceeded those levels since 2019. And then option 2 produces the lowest coastwide cap, and landings have exceeded this cap in all years since 2015. So functionally, it has the most potential to reduce fishing mortality. And as a reminder, that option 2 is the recommended option that the SAS put forward in the stock assessment document. So now we'll move on to the management response to exceeding the coastwide cap. The status quo option is that if landings exceed the cap by 10% for 2 consecutive years, then the states whose landings are greater than 1% of the coastwide landings in the years when that cap is exceeded will be responsible for reducing their landings to achieve the coastwide cap in the subsequent year. Our option 2 in this document would modify this response so that the states whose landings are greater than 5% of the coastwide landings would be responsible for reducing their landings to achieve the coastwide cap in the subsequent year. So this option is responding to the fact that as total landings of yellow eel have declined drastically over the past few years, states with very minimal landings are still winding up contributing more than 1% of the total coastwide landings. So just for a visual, the shaded cells in this table, which apparently do not show up on this projector. Okay, that one shows it. So this shows the states whose landings were greater than 5% of the coastwide total in each year since 2014. So now I'll move on to the options on the time frame for these yellow eel cap provisions. So the PDT developed 2 proposed options for consideration. Option 1 is that the cap would not have a sunset date, but that it would have to remain in place for 3 years before being updated. The 3-year minimum time frame is recommended because less than 3 years of data with the cap in place would be insufficient for evaluating the performance of that cap. And then option 2 is that the cap would again not have a sunset date, but that it would have to remain in place for 5 years before being updated. And 5 years is also recommended as more years of data would make a more robust data set to look at that cap. So I want to note here that when it says update the cap, we are talking about adding additional years of catch and index data and running that through the iTarget tool as it's configured by approval of this addendum, if that's the way it goes. So it would not allow for changes to be made to the reference period, multiplier, and threshold that are set through this action. If changes to those items or the configuration of iTarget is desired, then that would require a new addendum. And that's under either of these options. So that is the end of the provisions related to the cap. And then these are the options related to the young of year survey sampling. Option 1 is status quo, which would mean the states must continue to collect individual length and pigment stage data during the young of year surveys. And then option 2 is that the biological sampling of length and pigment stage would become optional. So as I mentioned, this was a recommendation from the stock assessment subcommittee and the technical committee in the 2023 assessment, and that would ease the monitoring burden on some of the states. Next are options related to the fishery dependent catch and effort monitoring. So option 1, status quo, is that the requirement for harvester reporting of trip level CPUE data, which was established by addendum 1, would be maintained. This means the states would continue to require trip level CPUE data in harvester reports, including soak time, number of units of gear fished, and pounds landed. And then option 2 is that the states would no longer be required to collect trip level CPUE data for yellow eel catch. The states, of course, would be able to continue to require those data if they choose to do so. And the majority of states, when we asked the technical committee, indicated that they would collect these data even if it were voluntary. And then as a note, this option is specific to yellow eel and does not apply to glass eel fisheries. And similar to the young of year survey options, this was proposed to ease the monitoring burden on states since there are no plans to use those catch per unit effort data for the assessment. And the technical committee has no concerns with making this an optional requirement, optional data. So that was the last of the options that were included in the draft document that you received in the materials. However, I wanted to offer for the board's consideration the potential to add options to this addendum that address the Commission's new de minimis policy, which was modified in November 2022. So in that new policy, the standard is that a state can be considered de minimis if the average landings for the last 3 years is less than 1% of the coastwide landings. However, the American Eel FMP uses the average landings of the last 2 years to evaluate the state's qualification for de minimis status. And the new commission policy doesn't automatically update the de minimis criteria for any of our species FMPs. So that change has to be made through an addendum or an amendment for each species. And it's also not required that the board adopt the new standard for American eel, but if the board wants to keep using 2-year average landings rather than 3 years, then it needs to provide a rationale as to why 2 years is more appropriate for eel than 3 years. So if the board does want to add options to address the de minimis policy, then these are 2 draft options for consideration that could be easily thrown into the addendum. Status quo would be to continue using the average landing for the preceding 2 years to evaluate de minimis status. And again, it would need to include a rationale as to why. And then option 2 would be to update the criteria to apply the commission policy to eel, meaning that a state would be de minimis if the average landings for the last 3 years is less than 1% of the coastwide landings. So thanks for hanging in there. That wraps up all of the options. And then this is our potential timeline again for next steps. So if the board approves this for public comment today, we would start the public comment period and state hearings in February, and the board would be able to consider draft addendum 7 for final approval in May at the spring meeting, and then would determine the implementation dates for the different provisions of the addendum. So with that, these are the board actions to consider. First, the board should consider any modifications to the document, including whether or not to add these de minimis policy options, and then consider approving the document draft addendum for public comment. So with that, I can take any questions.
Thanks, Caitlin. Questions for Caitlin? Megan Ware.
Thanks. I just had 2 questions. My first is under 3.2 timeframe. You were kind of getting at it with your slide there. So if maybe this reflects that I don't totally understand iTarget, but if the time frame, the threshold, and the other value are not changing, does that mean the catch cap is also not changing with new data, or it is?
The catch cap would be updated if you add additional years of data from the abundance index and the coastwide landings data into the iTarget tool. It would take those 2 things into account and produce a new catch cap.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question was on the catch and effort monitoring section. Under option 2, it says states would no longer be required to mandate that harvesters or dealers report certain things. One of them's pounds landed. I assume that is harvesters or dealers, not both. And if that's the case, we might just want to clarify that.
Yeah, so just to clarify, the requirement to report landings, pounds of landings, would still remain for either harvesters or dealers, as was in the addendum 1 language, but it wouldn't be per trip or per gear type. You wouldn't have to report it separately for each of those different pieces of effort data, if that makes sense.
Okay, so as an example, a harvester would still need to report total pounds landed, I'll say monthly or whatever the reporting time frame is, but not per trip or gear type?
Yes.
Okay. I think we could better clarify that maybe in option 2, but I'll see what others have to say.
Thanks, Megan and Caitlin. Erica Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question about 3.2 as well, the time frame for yellow eel provisions. And this is more of a philosophical type question. So this addendum would put in place something that says the cap cannot be updated for either 3 or 5 years. Technically, is it possible to hold the board to something like that? What would prevent a board from coming in and saying in year 2 or year 4, depending which option is chosen, that they wanted something changed? Is that even feasible?
Yeah, so without a new addendum, it would remain in place for 3 years. But if the board were to initiate a new addendum to change that management program, it could change the coastwide cap earlier.
Thanks, Harriet. Thanks, Caitlin. Any additional questions? Lynn Fegley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment, so cut me off if it's inappropriate, but I think for the I target, it would help people to understand, and I don't have a specific language modification, but if you take that, so I'm looking right now at figure 11 in the addendum that shows the different iterations of I target. So the lowest version, as I understand, the option for the 200 something thousand catch cap is the last time, it's the terminal year of that time series, but that catch cap was calculated across the time series and starts at a level that's higher, maybe close to 500,000, if I'm making sense. So I think it would help the public to understand that it is the index and the landings that are driving the changes in that I target. That we're going to choose to set a cap somewhere, but that cap would be changing if we were to run it based on what the index and the landing show. And I only say that because I think it'll help people understand. And if we can see that there's some sort of change in a positive direction, maybe that would provide some motivation for the board to initiate that addendum. I don't know. It's really hard to wrap your head around the fact that you're sort of watching this time series of a cap and we're setting it at a terminal year. And somehow I think there's some language to help clarify that a little bit.
Thanks, Lynn. I think I can work on kind of clarification of that in the document.
Shannon Madison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we might be getting into comment zone. So kind of a long, first of all, I want to say I completely agree with Lynn. I think that would really, really help this document to shine a little bit more. I think the public's going to have a hard time understanding what iTarget is, and it's actually kind of simple in its essence. So it just needs some more wording to kind of help that along, in my opinion. The other thing that I didn't notice in the document, and if I'm wrong, Caitlin, please feel free to kick me, but I think it's kind of important to give that SAS recommendation that was, if we were going to vary anything, we should be varying the threshold, or yes, the threshold, but not the reference periods or the multipliers. I think it would be really useful in 3.1, and I think we should also say it in option 3, because I think you guys do a good job in option 2 of laying out what the SAS recommendation was, and the SAS said to us, please keep these 2 things, but if you want to modify, this would be a really good way to do it. So I think it's important for us to note that in this document.
Thanks for that, Shannon. Lynn Fegley.
So I do have a question now based on what Shannon just said. So when this decision is made, does the board have the opportunity to pick a cap within the range of what is presented, or will the board be restricted to picking a cap based on particular knobs, if you get my question?
I believe the board would be able to pick a cap that falls within the range of cap values. So that 916,000 that we have now, and the lowest one is 202,000 something. So I think if it were in that range, even though it's not produced by iTarget, it would still be on the table because our current cap is not based on iTarget.
Thanks for that, Lynn and Caitlin. Any additional discussion here? John Maniscalco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Caitlin's response kind of confused me. I mean, I thought we were trying to be driven by the iTarget and by setting those knobs, and then in the future, just responding to how landings and index values changed over time, and choosing some other cap. And ignoring the iTarget advice doesn't make a lot of sense. I thought we were trying to kind of set a basis for what we're doing. So I understand the board usually has the discretion to kind of set a cap, you know, given the, you know, the spread of options that we put out to public comment, but I guess I would discourage that, and it just sounds counterproductive. I don't know if there's a way to kind of force the board to use the knobs that we set rather than give us that discretion to, you know, use a little bit too much discretion. Thanks.
Thanks, John. I'm not sure I know the answer to that one. I mean, you could pick between the range right now, but I understand where you're coming from with the sticking to the set values that come out of the black box, so to speak. Is there any additional discussion? You have some comments on that, Caitlin?
Yeah, I can just add that ability for the board to pick a cap between those two values is just an artifact of the way all of our commission documents work. It's possible for the board to choose any option that falls within the range that goes out for public comment, and that also includes combining things across options or issues.
Thanks, Caitlin. Okay, we'll move this along a little bit. So are there any additions that the board would like to see for de minimis or other modifications to the addendum that we can? Shannon?
I just think that Lynn and John have pointed out something that maybe should be in the document to let the public know that is, and I realize this is something that we can do for all of our species. So if we can just pop something in there that does exactly that. And then my other comment is, I think that what you guys have prepared for another set of options for de minimis is sufficient. I was happy with those, and I'm okay adding those to the document.
That language is already in the document about being able to combine and pick between the range.
Thanks, Caitlin. So seeing no other discussion around this, is there any motions that we could entertain here at this time for Erica Burgess?
So I'm assuming we need a motion to add the change for the de minimis requirement. So
I believe we could do it without a motion if there's agreement among all of the board.
Is there any disagreement to Erica's comments there and the addition? Okay, we'll just go ahead and add that to the, okay, Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Caitlin, I did find that section under 3.0. I think what John is getting at is still something maybe important for us to say, like, yes, we can choose from the range of options. However, they may not be supported by some configuration of iTarget, because I think that's an important distinction to make. Thank you.
Tony.
That is the status quo option. So that is pulling from the range of options. I mean, we can try to add some language in there, but that is, the status quo option is just a arbitrary value that the board chose the last round. So you're taking the arbitrary value and then using a reduction, if it were a reduction of it could be anywhere between what the current value is and the lowest value in the options, because you're combining those two. Status quo, which is you're using the rationale of status quo with the reductions of iTarget.
Thanks, Tony. It seems like what we're discussing here are modifications to the addenda for clarification's sake, not necessarily, in my interpretation, the options. Is there any additional discussion on clarification to Shannon?
Sorry, just a question to Tony's point. Tony, what does that mean if we selected something outside of the iTarget values for the other sections of the document that discuss timing of when we would look at the cap in relation to iTarget?
I believe it would mean that whatever level is set, if it's not set using iTarget, then it would just remain in place indefinitely because it's saying in those two options that it has to remain in place for 3 years if you're using iTarget.
Thanks, Caitlin. So are there any motions to modify the options? Okay, seeing none. We need a motion to approve and document. Is someone willing to make that motion? John Clark, seconded by Shannon Madsen.
No, I'm not willing to do that. I was going to propose something different.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
My apologies.
I'm sorry about that for the confusion. I wanted to move to postpone further action on the coastwide cap options until coastwide landings reach 600,000 pounds in a given year. And if I can get a second, I can speak to that.
Do we have a second? Sorry, Russ Dice, second. You want to speak to your motion?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I find this whole process has been very upsetting to a lot of people that have been obviously to a lot of yellow eelers. But in addition, I just think it's very unnecessary at this time. This is a market-driven fishery. We've seen landings, as pointed out in the presentation. We were above the coastwide cap as recently as 2016. In the last few years, we've been well below 500,000 pounds. If we look at the catch in the fisheries, we see that the catch per unit effort, especially in the Chesapeake, which is Maryland is the bulk of the landings, has actually been going up. As has been pointed out, over the decades that we've been looking at eels, we actually have almost looks like two different populations of eels, the estuarine eels, which is where all the fisheries are prosecuted, and then eels in freshwater. Their fates do seem to be differing, where the freshwater eels are in much bigger trouble than estuarine eels. I think, as was just pointed out with the glass eels, the fact that we're talking about the recommended option in here from this iTarget method is a enormous cut in the coastwide cap. I know this is just a proposal at this point, but it's bringing a lot of consternation to those who do fish for eels. And as I said, based on the fact that this is a fishery that is market dependent and it doesn't look like the market is coming back anytime soon, I would just say our current system is not broken and this is not the fix that we need. And I'd just leave it alone at this point. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Russ Dice, as a seconder, would you like to add any comments to that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think if you look at the graph, what John was talking about is that our line of catch is down, but the reason is because there's no market. In our area, I'm a fisherman, in our area of the Chesapeake Bay, we got so many yellow eel, that someone handlining or still fishing for perch have a hard time catching a perch because we got so many eels. You can throw an eel trap over and it'll fill in a matter of hours. The problem is we can't sell them. All of our commercial guys that were selling eels have quit. They can't sell them. They had to do something else. So I agree with John that the problem isn't here. And I think you'll find out where they're taking their samples in the Hudson River and in Maryland and the Upper Bay, where we have an abundance of blue cats and snakeheads, that you're not going to get a very good sample in those areas. And I understand you have to have 10 years of sampling before you can have that to be what you're going to go by. And I think it's time you move the sampling to another part of another area on the coast, because we may never have any more eels in the Hudson River and in the Sassafras River in Maryland. But down our way, We got buku eels. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Russ. Erica?
Thank you. I had a question for clarification, but I see that staff has modified the motion, although the motion's already been seconded, so it belongs to the board. So I don't know if that's in order to do that. But my question was whether the actions in the draft addendum under consideration regarding monitoring would still move forward. John, is that your intent?
Yes, Erica, I just wanted to postpone action on the cap. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Erica. Any other discussion on the motion? I'm sorry, John.
Tony said that I needed to say that into the record. So yes, my intention is that all other parts of the addendum would move forward and just remove or just postpone action on the cap part of the options. Thanks.
Okay, do we have any public comments on the motion? Yeah, McCarran.
My question is, John's proposal, and it is an interesting one, but couldn't he bring up that same motion after this goes to public hearing? I mean, I guess I'd like to have a chance to talk to my TC members, and I'm kind of intrigued by it, but couldn't you make that same motion at the next meeting?
John Clark, response.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Dan, if I can channel my inner Tom Foti, I've been on eels for such a long time that I remember back in 2008, I was on the technical committee and we had come up with a life table method for trying to reduce yellow eel mortality by coming up with a slot that could be harvested. So you'd have to let go eels that were smaller than the slot, eels that were larger to get more escapement. And the board, it did go out to the public that way. And then the board just rejected going with the life table type of reductions that would have been required there and just took approved the other parts of the addendum. So could be done that way. I just wanted to put on the record, I'm just very skeptical of some of these cap numbers that are coming up.
Thanks, John. Shannon Matson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As much as I love John and as much as I love the first state, I have to say I'm going to oppose this motion. And going through the stock assessment, I think one of the things that really hit home for me is this one sentence that says, the SAS thinks that continued fishing pressure on a depleted stock is likely contributing to the continued decline in abundance seen over several assessments, being the 2012 one, the 2017 one, and the 2013 one. I think that we're being incredibly irresponsible by not taking this out to public comment and at least having the discussion on what these target limits look like and what could potentially be feasible. We're at the point where we have been asked several times by our SAS, by our TC, to reduce fishing pressure on this specific life stage of eels. And every single time we have declined and or have raised the cap. So I can't support this motion. Thank you.
Joe Semino.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I echo Shanna's comments on both trying to be supportive, but also, there has to be some need for concern here. This is a species that's life history is very complicated. Our understanding of its population is very complicated. It's one that's been discussed for listing at times. So to just, push this off for a future date on a poundage that isn't even something that would hurt our commercial fisheries at this point. I would much rather see this go to public comment as is. And I think there's darn good reasons for it. So thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Rick Jacobson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with some of the comments that have been offered that I do not support this motion. Given the status of the stock and the declining status over the years, I do believe that we need to go out to public notice or public comment with these sorts of options. We've given due diligence into analyzing what may be drivers to the abundance issue, and this is the best science we have available to us at this time. Add to that, if we were ultimately to conclude that this is the right time to lower the coastwide cap, no better time to do it than during a period when the actual harvest is decreased and it's easier to adopt that or to accept that change. So I can't support the motion at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Okay, we've had considerable discussion on this item. I think we're ready to call the question. I'm assuming there's going to be a need to caucus, so we'll go with 2 minutes for caucus. Okay, we have 2 minutes. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. Before I call the question, I'm going to read this motion back into the record. It moved to approve sections 3.1 and 3.2 from the draft addendum and postpone further action on coastwide cap options until coastwide landings. Did I say, I'm sorry. Looks like I read that wrong. So I'll start over. Apologies. Move to remove sections 3.1 and 3.2 from the draft addendum and postpone further action on the coastwide cap options until coastwide landings reach 600,000 pounds in a given year. Motion made by Mr. Clark and seconded by Mr. Dice. All those in favor, raise your hand. All those opposed? Any null votes? Abstentions? The motion fails 1 to 18 to 0 to 0. John Clark.
I'll take another crack at this. How about, like to make a motion to remove option 3.1, remove section 3.1 option 2. That's the lowest cap value in the document.
Thank you, John. Do we have a second? Megan Ware. John, would you like to provide some additional rationale?
Yeah, obviously the board has made it clear that they'd like the coastwide cap options to go out to the public. I just think this one would have zero possibility of ever passing the board and is probably the one that would be most concerning to the eel fishermen, and sort of the similar reasoning to the that was used for the glass eel addendum. It's why would you take something out that really is just going to cause a lot of concern and worry when it's not something that we probably want to consider as a board? Thanks.
Thanks, John. Megan Ware, any additional comments?
Seconded for discussion, so John could provide his rationale. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're running behind, obviously. So let's go ahead and take any comments in support of John's motion. Lynn Fegley.
Yeah, so I would go ahead and support this. And I recognize that this is what was recommended by the scientists. But, I will say that while I do, have concern about the potential recruitment overfishing of yellow eels, but I also have concern that we really have very little understanding or analysis of the levels of fishing mortality that are happening on glass eels, and glass eels become yellow eels. We also have an issue in Maryland where we have the highest catch per unit effort in the history of our time series. And I understand where, that's a local view. It's a concentration, but a 200,000 pound catch cap is essentially a moratorium. You might as well go there if you're going to go to 200,000 pounds. So while I am in the camp of making a move on this fishery and not ignoring the problem, I could support removing this lowest option.
Thanks, Lynn. I'll take one more comment in support if there are any. It differs from what the rationale Lynn provided. Okay, seeing none, is there any comments in opposition to that before we call the question? Okay, assuming again there's going to be a need for caucus. Okay, I'm not seeing any yes. Okay, we'll take 1 minute. Okay, I'm going to read the motion back into the record before we call the question. Motion to remove sections 3.1, option 2. Motion by John Clark, second by Ms. Ware. All those in favor, raise their hands. Okay, you may lower your hands. All those opposed? Okay, lower your hands. Null votes? Abstentions? Okay, the motion fails 8 to 11, 0. Okay, are there any additional modifications to the draft addendum for public comment? Okay, seeing none, do we have a motion to approve the draft addendum for public comment? Sheree Patterson, seconded by Shannon Madsen.
I'm just going to read it. Move to approve draft addendum 7 for public comment as modified today.
Shannon, any additional comments? Okay, we'll do this, try this the easy way maybe. Is there any opposition to this motion? Okay, seeing none, the motion passes by consent. Okay, we have 2 items remaining on the agenda. So let's move on to item 6 on the agenda, which is to consider the approval of the fisheries management plan review and state compliance reports for 2022 fishing year. Caitlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to make this briefer than it was supposed to be, but I'll quickly go over the status of the fishery and then the PRT review of the state compliance and their recommendations. So I'm going to skip through these first couple of slides, just showing on the screen. These are the glass eel fishery regulations in place under the FMP, and there hasn't been any changes in recent years. These are the yellow eel fishery regulations. And then these are the silver eel fishery regulations. And then in addition, there's other management measures in place, including the catch and effort reporting, sustainable fishery management plans, and then that there have not been changes in those as well. Just an update, Maine has used the aquaculture plan provision. They've submitted a continuation of the aquaculture plan for 2023. That was approved by the board in August 2022, and 200 pounds were harvested by American Unagi in 2022. For commercial landings, the state reported landings of yellow and silver eels were around 334,653 pounds in 2022, and that's a 2% increase from 2021. The states that contribute 91% of the coastwide harvest are Maryland, Virginia, New Jersey, and New York. And Maine's glass eel harvest in 2022 was 9,459 pounds. South Carolina also has minimal glass eel harvest, but it's confidential. And I'm not going to continue reporting on recreational eel fisheries because as we've discussed, the design of MRIP is not geared to inland fisheries, so we don't have any estimates. Unless this changes, I will no longer report on that. So this is the PRT review of the compliance reports. They found no issue with the glass eel fishery. And then with regard to the yellow eel provisions, the PRT noted one issue, which is that New York's regulations for minimum mesh size are not consistent with the requirements of the FMP. Addendum 3 requires states and jurisdictions to implement a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch minimum on the mesh size that's used in the commercial yellow eel pots. And Addendum 3 allowed states to use an escape panel constructed of that mesh size for 3 years in order to reduce the financial burden on the fishery for those gear changes. However, that provision for the 3-year escape panel thing has expired. So now all the yellow eel pots should be required to use the minimum mesh size regardless of the presence of an escape panel. New York's regulations still allow the pots to have the escape panel instead of using the minimum mesh size. So therefore, New York should update those regulations to require the minimum mesh size for all yellow eel pots to meet the FMP requirement. For silver eel, the PRT noted 2 small issues, which are that Delaware and Florida have not implemented regulations that prevent harvest of eels from pound nets from September 1st through December 31st. However, Delaware has not had any reported pound net landings for 50 years, and they will be able to address this issue the next time they have to make a change to their eel regulations. And Florida is also unaware of any active pound net fishery in the past 10 to 15 years. As discussed earlier, the de minimis threshold for eel is that average landings for the 2 preceding years must be under 1% of the coastwide landings for a particular life stage. For this year, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, DC, Georgia, and Florida all requested de minimis status for yellow eel. So while the rest of the states qualify, Florida's average landings for 2021 and 2022 are greater than 1% of the coastwide landings, and it's 2.25% of the coastwide. The PRT recommends that the board consider those compliance issues that they noted, and then they also recommend that New York separate the yellow and silver eel landings in their reporting. The PRT maintained their recommendation for the states to quantify upstream and downstream passage and provide information to the TC for evaluation regularly. And to address this, they suggested making a section in the compliance report so that the states are reporting on this annually. The PRT also recommends the board engage the Committee on Economic and Social Sciences to conduct an analysis of market demand specific to the food versus bait markets and international market demand, and also recommends working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife to compare the U.S. landings and the exports. So with that, I can take any questions.
Any questions for Caitlin? Okay, if there's no more questions, Grout.
I just wanted to ask Mr. Chairman, has there been any reason that New York has not passed those changes to the minimum mesh size? And if not, is there plans to change those in the near future?
Would you like to address that, John?
Yeah, thank you. So just an oversight, and we will address it as quickly as possible to our regulatory.
So are there any modifications to the FMP as presented? Someone willing to make a motion to accept the FMP review? Ingrid Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Move to approve the American Eel FMP review for the 2022 fishing year, state compliance reports, and de minimis status for New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, DC, and Georgia.
Of a second by Megan Ware. Or no, I'm sorry, Lynn Fagley. They're sitting somewhat close together. Any comments on that? Okay, it's getting late. My apologies. So is there any opposition to the motion? Seeing none, the motion passes by consent. Okay, so we'll move.
And I just wanted to clarify that if, unless I hear any objections, I will add a section to the compliance reports for the states to report on their upstream and downstream passage.
Thanks for that clarification, Caitlin. So moving on to the last item on the agenda is to review and populate the advisory panel membership. And for this, I'm going to turn it over to Tina Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I offer for your consideration and approval 2 nominations to the American Eel Advisory Panel. Sarah Rademacher, sorry, Sarah, an eel acuculturist, and Timothy LaRoche, a commercial net fisherman. Both are from Maine, and they replace 2 previous advisors on the panel who are no longer active in the fishery. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. Do we have a motion regarding the nomination? Megan Ware. Second, Dan McKernan.
Move to approve Sarah Rademacher and Timothy LaRochelle to the Eel Advisory Panel.
So would anyone around the table like to make a comment? Okay, seeing none, is there any opposition to the motion? Seeing none, the motion passes by consent. So at this point, is there any other business that come before the American Eel Management Board today? Seeing none, do we have a motion to adjourn? Justin Davis. Second, Sherry Patterson. Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.